Did you know that the Bible revealed scientific truths long before modern science confirmed them? Today in our podcast, we'll explore 5 incredible discoveries that show how the Bible knew it first about matters related to science. Get ready to see how faith and science can go hand in hand to uncover amazing truths. Don't miss this episode full of fascinating insights and inspiration.
All right, buckle up everybody, because we're diving into a topic that might just rock your world a little bit. Ready to explore whether science and the Bible actually, agree.
Well, I can already tell it's going to be good.
I know, right? It sounds like we're about to mix oil and water here.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling this is going to get really interesting.
For sure.
We're taking a look at excerpts from this article. It's called, "Does Science Agree with the Bible?" And phew, it makes some pretty bold claims.
It really does. I mean, this is a question that has fueled, centuries of debate, right? So many people just assume that science and the Bible are, on opposite sides of this giant battlefield. But this article actually suggests that while the Bible isn't a science textbook, it's, surprisingly accurate when it comes to certain scientific concepts.
Right. It's like finding out your grandma was secretly a tech whiz this whole time.
Exactly.
So how is it even possible, right?
Yeah.
How could a book written thousands of years ago line up with, what we understand about science today?
Well, you got to think about it this way. Just because the Bible doesn't use all the fancy scientific terms we use now doesn't mean it's wrong.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
Right. So the article, it starts by comparing the Bible's account of, the very beginning of the universe with all these ancient myths.
Okay.
So Genesis 1.1, it just says, straight up, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, tons of other ancient cultures, they had these wild myths about the universe, emerging from this primordial chaos or, some pre-existing entity.
Right, like those Babylonian gods rising out of the oceans, or wasn't there one where the universe hatched from a giant cosmic egg?
Yeah, exactly.
So the Bible, it's presenting this very clear, distinct creation event.
Right, a definitive starting point.
Yeah, a starting point, which, seems way different from those other origin stories. Does that actually line up with, modern cosmology, what we know today?
It's wild how it actually connects with the prevailing scientific model we have for the universe's origin, the Big Bang Theory.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that the concept of the universe having a beginning, creation out of nothing, was in the Bible this whole time?
It was there all along.
Whoa, that's mind-blowing.
It really is, and it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
The article then goes on to highlight how the Bible emphasizes this universe governed by, consistent natural laws.
Okay.
Not by, the whims of the gods,
Oh, yeah.
It brings up verses like Job 38.33, which asks, do you know the laws of the heavens? And Jeremiah 33.25, which talks about God establishing a covenant with day and night and the fixed laws of heaven and earth. And this is a total paradigm shift compared to a lot of ancient cultures.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine living in a world where you believe that the gods could just, snap their fingers and anything could happen, good or bad.
Right, totally unpredictable.
Yeah. But the Bible, it's laying out this framework for an ordered system.
Yeah.
Right? Like a predictable universe.
And that idea, that is crucial for, the whole foundation of scientific thought.
Are you saying that for science to even exist, we have to operate under the assumption that the universe follows rules, consistent rules?
Exactly. If there were no consistent rules, then there'd be no point in experimenting or trying to figure out how things work, right?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. You wouldn't be able to find any universal laws if everything was just random.
Right. The scientific method is totally built on that assumption. And it's pretty amazing that the Bible, centuries before the scientific revolution, was already putting forth this idea.
That's wild. And speaking of revolutionary ideas, the article brings up Job 26.7, where it describes the earth as suspended in empty space.
He stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing.
I know. It's how did they know that back then?
Right.
It's as if they had a telescope hidden away somewhere.
I know, especially when you consider that so many ancient cultures envisioned the earth as flat.
Oh, yeah, resting on a giant or an animal.
A giant turtle, a buffalo,
Yeah.
all sorts of creatures.
And those beliefs weren't just some fringe idea. They were mainstream for ages.
Yeah.
When did the scientific community finally catch up and realize that the earth is, just hanging out in space?
Well, the idea of a spherical Earth, that actually goes back to some ancient Greek philosophers, but It didn't really gain widespread acceptance until much, much later.
Like when we're talking Copernicus and Galileo.
Exactly, in the 16th and 17th centuries.
So all that time, the Bible was like dropping these truth bombs about the Earth floating in space. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The article talks about the water cycle.
Okay.
Which, I mean, might seem obvious to us now, right? But back then, it was a pretty groundbreaking concept. It highlights verses like Job 36.27-28, which talks about water turning into vapor and then coming back down as rain. Then there's Ecclesiastes 1.7. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. And you've got Isaiah 55.10, Amos 9.6. They all talk about rain coming down from the heavens, watering the earth.
You have to remember that during those times, the ancient Greeks, who were considered super advanced, they believed that rivers were fed by these underground oceans.
Underground ocean?
Yeah. And that idea, it persisted for centuries.
It's amazing how long it can take for like a scientific concept to become, just common knowledge. So when did we finally figure out the water cycle? Was it during like the Renaissance? With all those geniuses running around?
I mean, there were definitely hints of understanding even in ancient times.
Okay.
But the Renaissance is really where we see some major progress. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Bernard Palissy, they made huge contributions to our scientific understanding of the water cycle. But even then, it took time for that knowledge to really filter down through society.
So it sounds like the Bible was way ahead of the curve on that one, too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's talk mountains. Psalm 104.6 and 8 mention mountains rising and falling, even being present beneath the ocean.
Huh. Interesting.
It's really different from those ancient myths that just chalked mountain formation up to, like, the actions of the gods, right?
It does seem to align with our modern understanding of plate tectonics, which, really revolutionized geology in the 20th century.
Plate tectonics. Are we talking about those giant pieces of the Earth's crust that are constantly shifting and colliding?
Yeah, you got it.
Wow.
That movement is what causes mountain ranges to form, volcanoes to erupt, earthquakes to happen. And the idea that mountains were once underwater, we've got geological evidence for that too. We find marine fossils way up high in mountain ranges, which tells us those rocks were once at the bottom of the sea.
It's like finding a message in a bottle from the distant past.
I like that.
Could the authors of the Bible have possibly had any idea about these huge geological processes? Or is this just, some crazy coincidence?
Well, that's a question that has sparked quite a bit of debate, and I think it's one worth exploring further. What's particularly fascinating about these verses is that they seem to kind of hint at this idea of a dynamic Earth.
Okay.
Like a planet where change is the norm, not the exception.
Yeah.
This is a pretty stark contrast to the static view of the world that you often find in those old mythologies.
It really challenges the idea of like this fixed, unchanging creation.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of challenging ideas, the article jumps into some of those, classic misconceptions about the Bible and science.
Oh, yeah, those persistent myths.
Right.
The ones that just won't die.
Exactly. And I'm ready to bust some myths.
Let's do it.
Okay, first one up. The Bible says the universe was created in 6 24-hour days. But, the article points out that Genesis 1.1, it doesn't actually specify a time frame at all, right? It just says, in the beginning, which could mean millions, billions, even trillions of years.
Right. That's a super important point. The Hebrew word for day, it can actually refer to different lengths of time.
Okay.
Not just a literal 24-hour period. And when you look at the creation account in Genesis, those days, they seem more like distinct epochs or stages in the whole creation process.
Like major phases of development.
Exactly.
Makes a lot more sense if you think about how long it actually took for stars to form, galaxies to evolve, life to emerge on Earth.
Precisely. It's about understanding the language in its, historical and literary context.
Right.
Another common one is the Bible says vegetation was created before the sun, which obviously wouldn't work for photosynthesis.
Yeah, how would plants survive without sunlight?
Right. Well, this misconception comes from taking a passage out of context. Genesis 1.1 clearly states that God created the heavens, which, of course, includes the sun, before vegetation.
The sun was already there.
It was there.
Maybe it just wasn't, shining as brightly.
That's a possibility. The text suggests that, during those early stages of creation, the Earth's atmosphere was probably super dense or maybe even cloudy, filtering the sunlight.
Right.
And then as the atmosphere cleared, the sun's light would have gotten stronger, allowing for photosynthesis to happen.
It's like having a dimmer switch on the sun.
Yeah, exactly. It makes sense that as the Earth's atmosphere evolved, so did the intensity of the sunlight.
Right. Right. Next up, the Bible says the sun revolves around the earth.
Oh, this is a classic.
I know, right? Isn't this like a pretty clear example of the Bible getting it wrong?
Well, this one often comes from verses like Ecclesiastes 1.5, where it talks about the sun rising and setting.
Okay, yeah.
But that's simply describing the apparent motion of the sun from, our perspective here on Earth. I
Right.
mean, we still use those terms today, even though we know it's actually the Earth that's rotating.
So it's a matter of perspective.
Mhm.
Kind of like when you're on a train and it feels like the world is moving past you, but really you're the one moving.
Exactly. It's all about understanding how our perception of the world shapes the language we use to describe it.
Right, right. Okay, so far so good.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible's track record is looking pretty decent here.
Not bad.
But here's a big one, okay? The Bible says the earth is flat. Surely there's no way around this one, right?
This is another example of interpreting the text literally when it's clearly meant to be understood figuratively.
Ah.
The Bible uses phrases like the ends of the earth and the four corners of the earth, but those are just expressions, right? They're meant to convey this sense of the earth's vastness and completeness, not its actual shape.
It's like when someone says, I searched high and low. You don't actually think they were, like, up in the clouds and digging in the dirt.
Exactly. It's poetic language, not a scientific textbook.
Okay, got it.
Makes sense, right?
Right. All right, one last myth to bust. The Bible says the circumference of a circle is exactly 3 times its diameter, which, mathematically speaking, just isn't true.
This one comes from the description of a large basin in 1 Kings 7.23 and 2 Chronicles 4.2.
Okay.
The text gives a rounded figure for the circumference, 30 cubits, and for the diameter, 10 cubits. But it's pretty likely that those were just approximate measurements, for practical purposes, not meant to be super precise mathematical calculations.
It's like when a recipe calls for about a cup of flour, you don't assume it has to be exactly 1 cup.
Right, and you wouldn't expect a cookbook to give you a whole scientific lecture on the chemical properties of flour.
Right. So the Bible wasn't exactly trying to win any awards for mathematical precision.
It's more about conveying spiritual and moral truths.
Right.
And it's important to remember that these ancient texts, they need to be interpreted within their historical and literary context.
For sure. Well, I think we successfully debunked those common misconceptions.
I think so too.
I'm feeling a lot more confident in saying that the Bible and science aren't, necessarily enemies.
I agree. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that even with these apparent alignments between the Bible and science, there are still areas where they might seem to diverge.
Oh, that's a really good point. We've been focusing on, like, the points of agreement, but what about the areas where they seem to offer different perspectives?
That's where things get really interesting. It's in those areas of tension where we can start to ask some deeper, more thought-provoking questions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of questions?
Well, for example, the Bible talks about miracles, events that seem to defy the laws of nature. How do we reconcile those accounts with our scientific understanding of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Are we supposed to take those stories literally, or are they more, like, metaphorical?
Well, there are different interpretations, of course. Some people believe that miracles represent like a genuine intervention from a divine power,
Okay.
moments when God suspends or even alters the natural laws.
So from that view, miracles are basically exceptions to the rules.
Yeah, you could say that.
Glimpses into a realm where the laws of physics don't quite apply.
Right. It's a pretty awe-inspiring concept.
It really is.
But then, others see these stories more as like powerful metaphors or allegories
Okay.
meant to convey deeper spiritual truths rather than literal historical events.
So in that interpretation, the focus is less on what actually happened and more on what the story represents.
Exactly.
Like maybe the parting of the Red Sea, it's less about the water physically splitting and more about, this symbolic liberation from oppression.
Yeah, or a leap of faith.
Right.
The emphasis is on the power of belief, the triumph of hope over despair, or maybe the intervention of a higher power in human affairs, but in a way that resonates with our spiritual understanding, not necessarily our scientific one.
It becomes more about the human experience, less about the mechanics of it all.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how one story can have so many layers of meaning. So where do we land on this? Is there a way to, like, bridge that gap between science and these accounts of miracles?
I think it depends on your personal worldview and how you approach the whole intersection of faith and reason. Some people find that accepting miracles requires a degree of, well, faith,
Right.
a willingness to believe that there are forces at work beyond our current scientific understanding.
Okay.
Others find that, the symbolic or metaphorical interpretation allows them to appreciate the spiritual messages of these stories without having to kind of reconcile them with the laws of science.
There's no right or wrong answer.
Not necessarily. It's more about personal interpretation and how we integrate these different ways of understanding the world.
It's pretty amazing how one conversation can open up so many different avenues of thought.
That's what I love about these kinds of discussions.
It really makes you realize that the world is full of mysteries.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of what makes it so fascinating.
For sure.
So, just to recap, we started this deep dive asking if science and the Bible could coexist.
And it seems like the answer is a lot more nuanced than just a simple yes or no.
A lot more complex.
Right. We've seen how the Bible, even though it's not a science textbook, aligns with some scientific concepts in really remarkable ways, even predating their scientific discovery by, centuries.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And we've talked about how some stories, like those about miracles, challenge our scientific understanding and invite us to consider different perspectives on the nature of reality.
It's like we've been on a journey through time, exploring ancient wisdom and modern knowledge.
And finding that both have something valuable to offer.
Exactly. This deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers, but honestly, I think that's a good thing.
Me too. It's in those unanswered questions, those areas where mystery still lingers, that we find the most potential for growth and discovery and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe we live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to our listeners, we leave you with this. If this conversation has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here. Keep digging, explore the Bible, dive into scientific discoveries, and see where those paths might intersect. You never know what amazing insights you might uncover.
You never know.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. So we've talked about all these amazing overlaps between science and the Bible, but now I'm kind of curious about those areas where they might, seem to disagree.
Right.
You mentioned miracles earlier.
Yeah.
Where do those fit in with our scientific understanding of the world? How do we even approach that?
It's definitely one of the most, I guess you could say, intriguing points of tension, right?
For sure.
Science, by its very nature, it tries to explain the natural world through things we can observe and repeat.
Right.
But miracles, they kind of seem to, defy those very laws that science so carefully tries to, figure out.
Right. It's like those stories make science say, hold on, wait a minute, the rules don't work here.
Haha. Yeah, exactly.
But how do we reconcile that? Are we supposed to take those miracle stories literally? Or is there a different way to understand them?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there are a few different schools of thought on this. Some people believe that miracles, they represent these genuine moments of divine intervention.
All right.
Moments where God actually chooses to operate outside of, or maybe even change, the natural laws that govern the universe.
So from that perspective, miracles are basically exceptions to the rules.
Yeah, you could see it that way.
Like little glimpses into this realm where the laws of physics just, don't hold the same power.
Yeah, it's a pretty awe-inspiring concept when you think about it.
It really is. But then on the other hand, some people view those stories more as powerful metaphors or allegories,
Right.
meant to convey deeper spiritual truths rather than actual events that, happened in history.
Yeah, exactly. So in that interpretation, it's not so much about the physical act itself, but more about the deeper meaning behind it.
Okay.
Right.
So maybe the parting of the Red Sea, it's not about the water literally splitting, but more about, symbolic liberation from oppression or
Yeah.
A leap of faith.
Exactly. It's about the power of belief, the triumph of hope over despair, or maybe even the intervention of a higher power in human affairs, but in a way that resonates with our, spiritual understanding,
Right.
not necessarily our scientific one.
So it becomes more about the human experience and less about the mechanics of how it happened, right?
Right.
It's pretty wild how one story can hold so many different layers of meaning.
It really is.
So ultimately, where do we land on this? Is there a way to bridge the gap between science and those, accounts of miracles?
Well, I think it might depend on your individual worldview, and how you kind of approach that intersection of faith and reason. Some people, they find that accepting miracles, it requires a certain degree of I guess you could say faith.
Right.
Like a willingness to believe that there are forces at work that go beyond what we currently understand through science.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
But then others, they find that the symbolic or metaphorical interpretation, it allows them to appreciate those profound spiritual messages within those stories without having to, try and make them fit with scientific laws.
So there's not really a one-size-fits-all answer.
Not really, no.
It's more about like personal interpretation and how we as individuals kind of integrate those different ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the beauty of this whole conversation, isn't it? It challenges us to like wrestle with these big questions,
Yeah.
to expand our thinking, and to recognize that there might be more to reality than what we can currently, perceive or explain through science alone.
It really makes you realize that the world is full of mysteries.
Mm.
And maybe that's part of what makes it so endlessly fascinating.
I think so.
So to wrap things up, we started this deep dive wondering if science and the Bible could coexist. And it seems like the answer is way more complex and interesting than we might have thought at first.
Definitely. We've seen how the Bible, while it's not a science textbook, it does align with some scientific concepts in pretty remarkable ways, even predating there's, scientific discovery by centuries.
Yeah, we talked about that.
They did.
And we've also discussed how certain stories, like those involving miracles, they challenge our scientific understanding and they kind of invite us to consider different perspectives on the nature of reality itself.
It's true.
It's like we've been on this journey through time,
Yeah.
exploring like ancient wisdom and modern knowledge and finding that both have something really valuable to offer.
And I think that's important.
It is. This deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers.
Me too.
But honestly, I think that's a good thing.
I agree. It's in those unanswered questions, those areas where mystery still kind of lingers, that we find the greatest potential for growth, for discovery, and for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe we live in.
So well said. And to our listeners, we leave you with this thought. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here. Keep digging. Explore the Bible, dive into those scientific discoveries, and see where those paths might intersect. You never know what fascinating insights you might uncover.
It's an amazing journey.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.